Over the last few years, and especially in Canterbury, the spotlight has never left the Earthquake Commission and its associated bodies. Articles in all forms of media have constantly featured families who are still grappling with the Commission after the earthquakes, even 5 years on. This made it an interesting potential candidate for this assignment. What swayed me, however, was the fact that my own family have only recently finished bouncing around the city after the September 2010 earthquake, when our Brooklands house was damaged beyond repair, and having spent most of my teenage years with terms like TC3, EQC and rebuild or repair bouncing around the house, I decided to become slightly less ignorant of the whole arrangement while I had the opportunity to do so. Constant questioning, both internally and externally, are the hallmarks of a government department, particularly the public perception of ineptitude the department will often suffer from. There are a few different factors to this that the public won't often consider. The public's expectations may be too high, or perhaps the department is underfunded or understaffed, and is actually performing quite well with the resources it has available. This often changes as a government's priorities do. A Labour government will very rarely see eye to eye with the national government on certain issues. My gut feeling before beginning any research, however, and certainly a commonly held public opinion, was that when a push came to shove, EQC was found out to be understaffed, underfunded, and was left scrambling to make up ground, especially when February came in on top of September. So, the issue I've decided on is, did the New Zealand Government, via EQC, do enough to prepare for the cost of major earthquakes in New Zealand? I will look briefly at the structure of EQC while covering the three aspects of research carried out during the assignment: taxation and appropriation planning, chains of responsibility and accountability, and financial and performance accounting. The Earthquake Commission is a Crown entity and was established under the Earthquake Commission Act 1993, which was a progression from the Earthquake and War Damage Commission that had existed since 1945. Their main roles are to provide insurance against natural disaster damage and, when a natural disaster is not being resolved, to ensure the growth of the Natural Disaster Fund, formerly the Earthquake and War Fund. This fund was started with a $1.5 billion lump sum treated as if from Her Majesty the Queen, i.e. the Crown, and was invested in various revenue gathering activities to make it grow. Additionally, some research into better natural disaster detection and management takes place. However, something EQC admitted in a December 2011 briefing to an incoming minister, a document I'll refer to several times throughout this presentation, was that even the September 2010 earthquake occurred on a scale they had not anticipated, let alone the February 2011 one and the following smaller events. This becomes quite important as my presentation moves on. My first line of inquiry was to find out how much of New Zealand's annual tax revenue was appropriated by EQC and whether that changed when the earthquakes made a relatively low-risk emergency fund suddenly extremely relevant. The first thing I found was that it isn't quite that simple, and that the initial views I held about the organisation structure were incorrect. My assumption when I chose to focus on EQC for this assignment was that they'd use a portion of taxpayers' funds to carry out their activities. However, I was wrong. Aside from that initial enormous appropriation of $1.5 billion, they don't interact with Treasury in such a direct fashion. Instead, they act like insurers and are paid through other insurers. When a homeowner takes out an insurance policy with AMI, for example, AMI will be obligated to pay a portion of this premium to EQC. In return, the dwelling receives up to $100,000 worth of insurance cover in the event of a natural disaster from EQC. This only typically applies to residential property. Under the terms of the Act, EQC has virtually no involvement in commercial buildings or land. Therefore, although EQC essentially exists due to a large initial appropriation, it doesn't rely on taxpayers' dollars to survive. This is actually an appropriate way to do things if you consider the equity principle of a good tax, that a tax should affect the group it is benefiting. New Zealand has a large number of people at all stages and incomes who do not own the homes they live in, instead renting them off a landlord. This is without taking into account people like students living at home and working part-time. Allocating a portion of their tax to pay for buildings they don't own to be repaired after an earthquake is unreasonable in normal circumstances. So as a basic plan, all of this is reasonable, and it would be fair to say that EQC has performed well in the mechanics of their idea. However, the simple fact of the matter is that in 2015 and after 2 earthquakes, the Earthquake Commission is scheduled to eventually run out of money. This indicates that despite elaborate appropriations, revenues and various smart investments, they of course invest their Natural Disaster Fund in various term deposits, things like that, to make it grow. They haven't claimed sufficient income to cover the expenses they are responsible for, which means the Crown has to guarantee any expenses that aren't met, and indicates that while the plan itself is viable, it may need to operate on a larger scale in future. EQC is an independent department but is nevertheless a Crown asset, not a private business. This means that ultimately the proverbial buck stops with the executive and the government. Any responsibility that EQC is unable to shoulder must be borne by them. Even if this wasn't legally the case, the nature of the New Zealand public is such that if John Key and his executive left Canterbury at the mercy of an underfunded and hopelessly understaffed government satellite, he would have found his party in the opposition exceptionally quickly. Which is certainly fair enough when you consider the fact that the government has a duty of care to the country it represents. As a result of this, the pre-existing pre-earthquake chain of command was added to somewhat after September and February. As I've stated previously, EQC's two main roles were to provide insurance to residential property owners in the event of a natural disaster, and we're not doing that on a massive scale to ensure the growth of the Natural Disaster Fund. This is by no means a comprehensive list of what needs to take place during a natural disaster. As I'm sure you'll recall, the Army, all three emergency services and civil defence were working non-stop in Christchurch for weeks. My own father works on avionics equipment in and around Christchurch Airport and spent huge amounts of time double-checking and triple-checking areas of the airport's infrastructure. Obviously EQC wasn't able to handle this alone, which is where the executive stepped into play, recognising that an emergency issue had moved up the chain of responsibility. The executive declared a state of national emergency which lasted for several months, cut a lot of red tape and remained in place long enough for whatever emergency structures that needed to take place took place. Various groups qualified to provide water, food, portaloos, anything like that that EQC was unable to cover in its own right were mobilised and performed reasonably effectively in the short term. EQC of course wasn't idle during this time. Their job was to begin mapping the damage to the city out so they could begin to deal with claims. According to the aforementioned incoming minister's report, they implemented their own catastrophe response plan. This was essentially EQC gearing up for war. They outsourced some of their work, which mostly included assessing homes, to outfits in New Zealand and Australia, bought up any excess space in the markets in the industry, and began training new staff to boost capacity. All of this was done in a relatively short space of time. This goes to show the chain of responsibility present between EQC and the executive. EQC handled all of the matters that had been mandated to by government, and the government filled the obligations they had for crisis management in the short term. In the long term, however, they began to become swamped, which is where we had issues with people waiting days for an assessor to arrive, being on hold for hours, various issues like that. As has been the case with every other aspect of EQC's function, their financial and performance accounting is geared specifically around building up the National Disaster Fund where no natural disasters have occurred and expending it to compensate property owners once a disaster has occurred. This is broadly similar to what you'll see in any form of insurance company, be it AA, state or AMI, with one key difference. The overarching goal is not to produce a profit for shareholders or directors, as would be the case in a private outfit such as these, but instead to merely ensure growth. As a government entity, everything is fed into the National Disaster Fund. There is no incentive to make a private profit for any directors, shareholders, anyone like that. Their financial statements from 2009, pre-earthquake obviously, reflect this. Their entire net profit figure was fed directly into their retained earnings and by extension the National Disaster Fund obviously. By contrast, the 2011 statements show a massive $11 million claims expense that absolutely destroys their income statement and knocks it down to a massive $7 million loss where they'd budgeted for a few $100,000 profit. Previously. This, of course, was to be expected. Two natural disasters had struck Christchurch in a very short space of time. So they are functioning appropriately. What is of concern, however, is how quickly the retained earnings figure disappeared between these two statements. In 2011, it is already long gone, and it leaked more than $1 million in deficit. This again shows that the executive and EQC were not prepared for the scale of what occurred during the aftermath of the two earthquakes in Christchurch. This was shown again by the incoming minister's report that was released in 2011. For a major natural disaster striking Wellington, The Earthquake Commission predicted there will be approximately 150,000 claims made. For a standard issue, if there is such a thing, natural disaster, there would instead be 80,000 claims that EQC would have to resolve. September 2010 alone brought in 160,000 claims, as did February 2011. In the 14 smaller earthquakes afterwards, this is the June one, the Boxing Day one, all of those smaller ones that followed on and did more damage to people's houses, almost as many claims were laid again once more. This goes to show that EQC was simply blown out of the water by the magnitude of the disaster that had occurred. All three of the aspects I researched and that I've just discussed have shown the same thing in different ways. EQC and the executive's allocation of resources to EQC and assistance provided to it were well organised, smoothly functioning and set in place to allow for a quick response to a natural disaster in the short term. However, they were woefully unprepared for the scale of the two earthquakes that struck Canterbury in 2010 and 2011, and the scale of their operations were found to be far too small. They were underfunded, undermanned and under-equipped for all of their build-up efforts. All of their plans were implemented, their war chest opened and emptied, and half a decade later, people are still sitting in broken homes wrestling with claims. This is not ideal, not what they intended to happen. So with respect to the original issue, did the New Zealand Executive Government via EQC do enough to prepare for the cost of a series of major earthquakes in New Zealand? The answer is clearly no, they didn't. They were swamped, overwhelmed and have failed many of their citizens accordingly. There are, however, mitigating factors in this. The option was always available in pre-earthquake years for a budget to allocate more funds to EQC. The legislation exists that will allow the government to place as many dollars as they'd like into it. However, there is little to no doubt that many of New Zealand's taxpayers would have been up in arms about such an expense. I know I would have been, especially given that in recent years tertiary students have been affected with significant cuts to student loans. The logic wouldn't be there if there hadn't been an earthquake and Bill English was directing funds towards an EQC war chest that realistically wouldn't be open while I was being belted on my student loan. It just doesn't work. So what the executive elects to direct Treasury to allocate funds to is always a contentious issue, especially for essential services. It would have been extremely unpalatable for Bill English to declare that he was prioritising a reserve fund on the low chance that a large-scale disaster was to strike a main centre. This means that the executive was essentially, when the earthquake struck, a victim of statistics and opportunity cost, and it can't necessarily be entirely held to blame for the fracas that ensued post-quake. This is a new one on us, as they'd say. What will, however, be of great interest in future years is whether New Zealand society changes their attitudes to hedging funds for national disasters. Given recent events in Nepal and Japan, it would seem that the Ring of Fire isn't quite yet finished with the human race and the land it lives on yet. And realistically, Wellington or Auckland could be struck any moment now or in the future. If either of these cities are hit, the damage will be far more significant than it was to Christchurch. It would seem that whether we want it to be true or not, we now live in a disaster-prone area of the world, and we will have to adapt our governmental spending accordingly. This will be interesting in future. As always, people won't be fond of austerity for the sake of something that may or may not even occur. However, we should bear in mind that the Alpine Fault has been a ticking time bomb for quite a while now, and when that goes, if it goes, we could be in a lot of trouble if the EQC chest is gone on what could actually end up being simply Mother Nature tickling the proverbial ivories. So, whether any extra funding actually takes effect, or whether we choose to repeat the mistakes of the past and not account for what may happen, will say much about human nature. As a learning exercise on the whole, this has been extremely interesting for me. Having my suspicions confirmed that EQC was actually blown out of the water by the scale of the earthquakes is always something that makes me feel smug. But actually coming to grips with the whole underlying system that failed so spectacularly well was one of the more curious parts of the whole assessment. It's yielded a degree of perspective on how non-essential government spending can suddenly become extremely essential indeed, and as a factor I will have to consider in both my accounting career and when viewing an executive announcement on budget day. This obviously has smaller parallels to working in any sort of firm, whether it's putting aside money in case the share market on that stable stable commodity suddenly collapses, in case our building burns down, anything like that that we think we may need some funds put aside for, may have to be prioritised over something that would be nice in the short term. It's all about risk management, and if nothing else, the Canterbury earthquakes have shown that we as New Zealanders need to take a lot more care in that respect. I hope you've gained a similar view from watching this presentation, and I thank you for your time.